She cooked beans for cowboys, but she had no idea that the quietest man at the table was about to hand her the entire world. It was a world made of dust and sweat and the endless aching horizon, but it would become hers. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The day began, as all her days did, in the thin, gray light before the sun. Ilara moved through the pre-dawn chill of the cookhouse like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. Her first act was always the same, stoking the embers in the great iron stove, coaxing them back to life. It was a ritual of resurrection, a small act of defiance against the encroaching dark. Outside, the land was a sleeping giant, its breath a cool wind that whispered through the cracks in the walls. This place, this sprawling, forgotten ranch, was the last stop at the end of the world, and she was its keeper of sustenance. Her domain was one of cast iron, simmering pots, and the perpetual earthy scent of pinto beans. She cooked for a dozen men whose names she barely knew, men carved from the same hard soil as the land they worked. They were loud, their laughter like rocks tumbling downhill, their arguments sharp and sudden as summer lightning. They ate with a furious hunger, their faces streaked with the grime of their labor, and they rarely looked at her. To them, she was a function, a pair of hands that turned flour into biscuits and dried beans into a meal that could carry a man from sunrise to sunset. And that was how she wanted it. Invisibility was a cloak she had woven for herself, thread by thread, a shield against a world that had taught her notice was a dangerous thing. She knew the shape of each man's shadow, the cadence of his walk, the way he held his coffee cup. She saw everything from her corner of the world, her small kingdom of heat and steam. There was Jeb, the foreman, with a temper as unpredictable as a dust devil. There was young Billy, barely a man, who still dreamed of a life beyond branding and fences. And then there was Silas. He was the quiet one. While the others jostled and swore, Silas would take his plate and find a spot by the door, his back to the wall, his eyes on the vast emptiness outside. He moved with a stillness that was unnerving, a stark contrast to the restless energy of the others. He ate slowly, deliberately, and when he was finished, he would bring his plate to the washing basin, dip his head in a gesture that was not quite a nod, and disappear back into the landscape that seemed to have spawned him. His silence was a language all its own, a deep well she could not fathom, and some days his quiet attention felt more piercing than all the other men's loud indifference combined. She would feel his gaze from across the yard as she hung out laundry, a steady, unreadable pressure. It made her skin prickle, her hands fumble with the clothespins. It was a look that didn't just see the woman cooking beans. It felt as though it saw right through her, to the broken, hidden things she kept locked away. The rhythm of the ranch was dictated by the sun and the needs of the cattle, a relentless, unyielding metronome. Ilara's own life was tethered to this rhythm, a smaller, quieter beat within the greater pulse. Her mornings were a blur of cracking eggs and flipping sourdough pancakes, the air thick with the smell of sizzling bacon and strong black coffee. The men would storm the cookhouse, eat their fill, and vanish with the rising sun, leaving behind a silence that was both a comfort and a weight. It was in these quiet hours that the ghosts of her past felt boldest, their whispers mingling with the hum of the wind. She would scrub the long mess table with a vengeance, the harsh lye soap a penance on her chapped hands, trying to scour away more than just the grease and grime. She was trying to scrub away the memory of softer hands, of a life where the smell of baking was of sweet cakes and not coarse bread meant for survival. The afternoons were for the beans. A great pot, blackened with age, would simmer on the back of the stove for hours, its slow bubbling the heartbeat of the kitchen. It was a simple, honest food for a simple, honest life, or so she told herself. There was no deceit in a pot of beans, no betrayal. It was what it was, and it asked for nothing in return. She found a strange solace in this simplicity, in the predictable transformation of hard, pebbly legumes into something warm and nourishing. This place, for all its hardness, was predictable. The sun rose in the east. The men were hungry at noon. The beans were ready by dusk. This predictability was the antidote to the chaos that had once defined her life. Here, she could almost believe she was a different person, someone whose past was as blank as the wide, empty sky. But then there would be moments. A flicker of something in Silas's eyes as he took his plate from her. He never spoke, not a thank you or a comment on the food. But his hands, calloused and scarred from work, would brush hers for a fraction of a second, a spark of warmth in her cold, solitary existence. It was nothing. It was everything. She would watch him from the cookhouse window as he worked, his movements economical and precise. He mended a broken fence line not with the angry force of the other men, but with a patient, methodical care, as if he were tending to a living thing. He gentled a spooked horse with a low murmur and a steady hand, his quiet presence a balm against the creature's panic. The other men respected him. She could see that, but it was a respect born of a quiet, unspoken understanding. He was an island of calm in their turbulent world, and Alara found herself, against her better judgment, drawn to that stillness. She started leaving a piece of cornbread by his plate, slightly larger than the others, or ensuring the coffee in the pot was fresh when he came in from a long ride. Small, insignificant gestures that she could deny if ever questioned. They were her own silent language, an answer to his. The memory arrived unbidden as it always did, triggered by the sharp metallic clang of the branding iron being dropped onto the hard-packed earth. One moment she was kneading dough, her knuckles white, her mind blessedly empty, and the next she was back there. She was standing in a different kitchen, one with polished wood floors and windows that looked out onto a neat, orderly street. The air smelled of lavender and lemon polish, not dust and wood smoke. A man was shouting. His voice, once a gentle melody in her ear, had become a weapon, each word a sharpened blade. It wasn't her name he was shouting, but a litany of her failures, a list of her sins scrolled out for the whole world to hear. He held a piece of paper in his hand, a letter she had written but never meant for him to see. Her hands, the ones now caked in flour, flew to her mouth, but it was too late to stifle the gasp, too late to take back the words, the feelings, the desperate, foolish dreams she had confessed to the page. He called her a cheat, a liar. He said she had broken the sanctity of their home, a home he had built for her, a life he had given her. And in his eyes she saw not just anger, but a profound, bottomless disappointment that was far worse than any rage. She saw the death of love, the curdling of trust into something ugly and permanent. She remembered the silence that followed his tirade, a silence more deafening than the shouting. It was the silence of a door closing forever, of a life ending. She had stood there frozen as he turned and walked away, not with the heat of passion, but with the cold, deliberate finality of a judge passing sentence. He didn't even look back. That silence had followed her across 3 states, a constant companion on dusty roads and in lonely boarding houses. It was the reason she now sought the quiet of this desolate ranch, the reason she flinched at loud noises, the reason she kept her eyes down and her words few. She was a woman who had gambled everything on a foolish hope and lost. She had betrayed a good man's trust, not with another person, but with a dream of a life she thought she wanted more. The irony was bitter on her tongue. She had longed for passion and adventure, and now she lived a life of monastic routine. She had craved a grand, sweeping love, and now her only interactions were the brief, impersonal exchanges over plates of beans. The branding iron clanged again, pulling her back to the present. The dough was sticky beneath her hands. Her cheeks were wet. She quickly, angrily, wiped the tears away with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of white flour on her weathered skin. She was no longer that woman. That woman was dead, buried under layers of dust and regret. Here, she was just Alara, the cook. A simple name for a simple existence. It was safer this way. No one here knew her sins. No one here could judge her. Especially not the quiet man with the watchful eyes, who seemed to see so much but thankfully could never see that. The dust on the horizon announced his arrival long before the buggy became visible. It was a different kind of dust, not the soft, swirling plumes kicked up by cattle, but a tight, angry cloud, moving with a purpose that felt alien to the slow, meandering pace of the ranch. The men in the fields paused, their hands shading their eyes. Ilara watched from the cookhouse door, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Strangers were rare here, and rarely did they bring good news. The buggy, sleek and black, was an obscene slash of city wealth against the muted browns and greens of the landscape. The man who stepped out of it was just as out of place. He wore a dark woolen suit despite the oppressive heat, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, already collecting a fine layer of ochre dust that he fastidiously tried to wipe away. He did not look at the cowboys who had gathered, their faces a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He walked directly to Jeb, the foreman, pulling a sheaf of papers from his breast pocket. Ilara was too far to hear the words, but she could read the language of their bodies. The stranger's posture was stiff, arrogant. Jeb's, usually so broad and unyielding, seemed to shrink, his shoulders slumping as the man spoke. The stranger would point to the papers, then gesture expansively at the land, a dismissive flick of his wrist that seemed to encompass the entire valley, the distant mountains, everything. Jeb's responses were clipped, his face growing darker with every passing moment. The other cowboys murmured amongst themselves, their easy camaraderie replaced by a tense, uncertain silence. Ilara retreated from the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that kind of man. She had seen the predatory gleam in his eyes before, the practiced smile that did not reach them. He was a man who dealt in ledgers and contracts, a man who could sign away a family's history with a flick of a pen. He was the world she had run from, a world of polite, legalistic cruelty, and it had followed her here to her last refuge. Later, when the black buggy had finally disappeared back into the shimmering heat haze, a pall had fallen over the ranch. The men's supper was a somber affair. The usual boisterous talk was gone, replaced by a heavy, brooding quiet that was even more oppressive than their noise. Jeb ate little, his gaze fixed on the tabletop, his jaw a hard line of frustration. Ilara heard snippets of conversation, words drifting over like tumbleweeds. Foreclosure, bank, drought last year, Mr. Henderson's debts, Mr. Henderson, the owner. A name she had heard only in passing, an abstract figure who lived somewhere far away. It seemed his distant troubles had finally come home to roost. She looked for Silas. He was in his usual spot by the door, seemingly unfazed. He ate his beans with the same slow, deliberate pace as always. But his eyes were not on the horizon tonight. They were moving, watching the faces of the other men, assessing the fear and the anger that radiated from them. He missed nothing. When he brought his plate to her, his gaze met hers for a moment longer than usual. There was no fear in his eyes. There was something else, something hard and resolute, like granite. And in that brief, silent exchange, a strange and unwelcome seed of hope began to sprout in the barren soil of Ilara's heart. The days that followed the banker's visit were heavy with a sense of impending doom. The men worked with a grim, joyless efficiency, the easy rhythm of their labor broken. Every distant cloud of dust on the road brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Every unfamiliar sound a tensing of shoulders. They were waiting for the axe to fall. It was during this tense period that Ilara began to see Silas in a new light. The ranch, seemingly on the verge of collapse, began to demand more than just routine work. A small herd of cattle, spooked by a predator, broke through a northern fence and scattered into the treacherous rocky canyons. Jeb organized a party of riders, their movements frantic, their shouts echoing with a desperate edge. But it was Silas who seemed to know the land not as a map, but as a living entity. He rode not with the main group, but took a path Ilara had never seen anyone travel, a thin, barely there trail that cut through the high ridges. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who was not fighting the landscape, but was part of it. Hours later, long after the other men had returned tired and with only a fraction of the missing cattle, Silas appeared at the edge of the valley. He was not driving the herd before him, he was leading them. They followed him in a calm, orderly line, drawn in by his silent, steady presence. He had found them, soothed them, and brought them home. The other men watched, their expressions a mixture of awe and bewilderment. Jeb just shook his head, a look of grudging respect on his weary face. Later that week, the main well pump, the lifeblood of the entire operation, sputtered and died. A vital gear had sheared off, a complex piece of machinery that Jeb declared would take a week to get from the nearest town, a week they didn't have. The men despaired, seeing this as the final blow. But while they cursed their luck, Silas was already at work. He disappeared into the old, dilapidated workshop, a place filled with forgotten tools and rusted metal. Ilara, drawn by the rhythmic sound of a hammer on an anvil, peeked through the dusty window. Inside, in the firelight of the forge he had coaxed back to life, Silas was not just a cowboy. He was a craftsman, an alchemist. His movements were deft and certain, his focus absolute. He heated, hammered, and shaped a piece of scrap metal with a skill that was both beautiful and brutal. He was not just fixing a machine, he was breathing life back into it. By morning, the pump was working again, its familiar rhythmic squeak a song of hope across the anxious ranch. He never said a word about it. When the other men clapped him on the back, he simply shrugged, his gaze deflecting the praise. But Ilara saw. She saw the quiet capability, the deep, unshakable competence that ran beneath his silent surface. He wasn't just another hand. He was the ranch's anchor, its silent, sturdy heart. He was the one holding it all together, even as it was threatening to fall apart. And she began to wonder with a growing sense of unease who he really was. The scent of rain on dry earth, petrichor. That was what triggered it this time. A phantom smell from a life ago. She was standing on a porch, watching a storm roll in, the air thick with the promise of release. A man stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Not the husband she had betrayed, but the one she had dreamed of in her foolish letter. He was a fiction, a composite of romantic novels and whispered fantasies, a man who promised adventure and a life less ordinary. In her mind, she had given him a face, a voice, a touch, and in her heart, she had given him a piece of herself that was not hers to give. The letter had been to her sister, a confession of her deep, aching unhappiness, her yearning for something more than the comfortable, predictable love her husband offered. She hadn't meant it as a plan, only as a desperate cry into the void. But her husband had found it, and he had not seen a cry for help. He had seen a meticulously planned betrayal. "Who is he?" he had asked, his voice chillingly calm. She tried to explain that there was no one, that he was just a phantom, a symbol of her own foolish discontent. But the more she tried to explain, the more it sounded like a lie, even to her own ears. "How do you explain that you have been unfaithful in your heart? That you have mourned a life you never had while living one that others would envy?" The ultimate betrayal was not that she had cheated on him, but that she had been ungrateful. She had taken his steady, reliable love and deemed it insufficient. The memory of his face, stripped of all warmth, all affection, was a brand on her soul. After she left, or rather, after she was told to leave, the consequences had rippled outwards. Her sister, horrified by the fallout, had sided with the husband. Her friends had faded away, uncomfortable with the messiness of it all. She was an outcast, a pariah, not for a crime, but for a feeling. She had learned the hard way that a woman's discontent was a dangerous thing. It had cost her everything, her home, her family, her name. She had wandered, taking menial jobs, always moving on before anyone could get too close, before they could see the stain she carried. Each new place was a new attempt at erasure. She had learned to be small, to be quiet, to expect nothing. She had starved her own heart of hope, believing it to be a dangerous, destructive force. Looking out from the cookhouse now, watching the real clouds gather on the horizon, the smell of the coming rain was not a promise of renewal, but a reminder of the storm that had wrecked her life. She saw the men securing the barns, their faces turned to the sky, and she felt a kinship with them. They were all about to lose their home. It felt like a grim, cosmic justice. She was a woman who had lost her own home through her own failings, and now she was fated to watch others lose theirs. There was a terrible symmetry to it. She deserved this, to be a witness to loss, to be reminded that nothing good ever lasted, especially not for someone like her. The first drop of rain hit the dusty ground with a soft hiss, and Ilara flinched, as if it had struck her own skin. The storm broke with a fury that seemed biblical. What began as a promising rain quickly devolved into a torrent, the sky a bruised purple, slashed with jagged forks of lightning. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at the old buildings, rattling the very bones of the ranch. Ilara stood by the window, watching the world dissolve into a churning chaos of water and wind. Suddenly, a deafening crack, louder than any thunder, split the air. A bolt of lightning had struck the ancient oak tree that stood beside the main barn, the one that held the winter feed for the cattle. In an instant, the rain-soaked wood exploded into flames, the fire greedily defying the downpour. Panic erupted. Men shouted, their voices swallowed by the gale. They ran towards the barn, but the heat and the smoke drove them back. The fire was spreading, licking at the dry timber of the barn walls. Inside were not just the feed stores, but a handful of new calves they'd moved in for shelter from the storm. Their terrified bellows could be heard over the roar of the fire. Ilara's mind went blank. All the fear, all the carefully constructed walls of passivity crumbled into dust. She didn't think. She acted. She grabbed 2 heavy burlap sacks from the pantry, plunged them into the rain barrel outside the cookhouse door until they were saturated and heavy, and ran. She ran towards the fire, towards the chaos, her feet sinking into the mud. The men shouted at her to stop, but she didn't hear them. She wrapped one wet sack around her head and shoulders and threw the other over her arm. She knew the barn's layout, every stall, every corner. She remembered a small secondary door on the far side, one that was rarely used. While the men fought the main blaze at the front, she slipped around the back. The smoke was a living thing, acrid and blinding. It clawed at her throat, burned her eyes. But she pushed forward, her mind fixed on the sound of the terrified animals. She found the calves huddled in a corner, their eyes wide with terror. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady. She untied their ropes, using the wet burlap to shield their faces and guide them, one by one, towards the small side door and out into the relative safety of the rain. It was a blur of heat, smoke, and primal fear. As she pushed the last calf out, a flaming beam crashed down from the loft, blocking her path back to the door. She was trapped. A wave of black despair washed over her. This was it. This was her end, a fiery penance for a life of quiet sin. She sank to the ground, coughing, the smoke stealing the air from her lungs. Then, through the shimmering heat and the swirling embers, a figure appeared. It was Silas. He moved through the inferno as he moved through everything, with a calm, impossible purpose. He tore away the burning debris with his bare hands, creating a path. He reached her, scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her out into the cleansing, violent rain. The last thing she saw before her world went dark was his face, soot-stained and grim, his eyes burning with an intensity that rivaled the fire itself. She awoke to the gentle, rhythmic sound of a dripping roof and the smell of coffee. She was in her own small room off the cookhouse, tucked into her narrow bed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air cool and sharp. Her throat was raw, her body ached, but she was alive. The door creaked open and Silas entered, carrying a tin cup of steaming coffee. He moved so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. He set the cup on the small crate beside her bed and stood there, his large frame seeming to fill the tiny room. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty. It was charged with everything that had happened, with everything that remained unsaid. Ilara struggled to sit up, wincing. "The calves?" she asked, her voice a rough whisper. "They're safe," he said. His own voice was low, deeper than she'd imagined. It was the first time he had spoken more than a single perfunctory word to her. "The barn? We lost part of the roof, the feed, but the structure is sound. We were lucky." He looked at her, and his gaze was steady, unwavering. There was no judgment in it, no pity. There was respect. It was a look she had not seen directed at her in years, and it made her profoundly uncomfortable. She felt the need to shrink, to disappear, to explain away her actions. "It was foolish," she croaked, looking down at her hands. They were red and blistered. He had wrapped them in clean bandages while she was unconscious. "I don't know what I was thinking." "You were thinking of saving them," he said simply. There was no praise in his tone, just a statement of fact. It was more powerful than any compliment. He pulled over a small stool and sat, creating a small island of shared space in the quiet room. He didn't press her to talk. He just sat, sipping his own coffee, sharing the silence with her. It was a companionable silence, a stark contrast to the lonely quiet she usually inhabited. In that moment, She understood that he had seen her. Not just the cook, not just the woman who had foolishly run into a fire, but the person underneath. He had seen the desperate act of a woman who, despite believing she had nothing left to offer, still had a core of fierce, protective loyalty. It terrified her. This kind of seeing was a responsibility. It demanded something in return, a truth she was not prepared to give. She had spent so long building her fortress of invisibility, and in one reckless act, she had torn it down. The other men, when she finally emerged from her room, treated her with a new, clumsy reverence. They mumbled their thanks, their eyes darting away from hers. They left a small pile of offerings on the cookhouse table, a polished river stone, a handful of late-season wildflowers, a carefully carved wooden bird. These small tokens of gratitude felt like accusations. They were accolades for a hero she did not believe she was. She was an imposter, and soon they would all be gone anyway. The ranch was still dying. A single act of courage couldn't stop the inevitable tide of foreclosure and debt. 2 days after the fire, the black buggy returned. The man in the suit was back, and this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by a sheriff, his badge a dull star of authority pinned to his vest. This was it, the final act. Ilara watched from the cookhouse window, her hands clenched in her apron, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The men gathered in the yard, a grim, defeated cluster. Jeb stood before the visitors, his face pale, his shoulders slumped in resignation. The man in the suit, whose name was apparently Mr. Davies, unrolled a document with a flourish. His voice was smug, carrying on the still air. As per the notice of default and the subsequent court order, this property, including all livestock and structures, reverts to the possession of West Valley Bank, effective immediately. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. He wasn't expecting a fight, but he was ready for one. The cowboys looked at each other, their faces a mixture of fury and despair. This ranch was the only home they knew. They were being cast out, their years of sweat and toil dismissed by a piece of paper. Jeb looked like he was about to say something, to argue, but the fight had gone out of him. The law was the law, and it was not on their side. Ilara felt a profound and bitter sorrow for these men, for this place that had, against all odds, become her sanctuary, for the illusion of safety she had allowed herself to feel. The universe was simply reminding her of a lesson she should never have forgotten. Nothing is permanent. Everything can be taken away. It was then that Silas moved. He had been standing at the edge of the group, silent and watchful as always. He walked forward, not with aggression, but with a slow, deliberate calm that immediately drew every eye. He stopped directly in front of Mr. Davies, who looked down his nose at Silas's dusty clothes and worn-out boots with a dismissive sneer. "And who might you be?" Davies asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Another hand looking for his last paycheck?" Silas didn't answer the question. Instead, he looked at the document in Davies' hand. "That paper," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of authority, "is based on the assumption of Mr. Henderson's debt." "It is not an assumption. It is a legal fact," Davies snapped. "The Henderson estate is bankrupt." Silas met his gaze. The Henderson estate was bankrupt. The debts were settled 3 weeks ago, in full. A stunned silence fell over the yard. Davies' smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "That's impossible. We would have been notified." "Your notification is right here," Silas said. He reached into his own worn jacket and pulled out a small, folded leather pouch. From it, he produced a set of papers, far less ostentatious than Davies', but clearly official. He handed them to the sheriff, not to Davies. The sheriff took them, his brow furrowed, and began to read. His eyes widened. He looked from the papers to Silas and back again. He cleared his throat. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. He looked at Davies. "This man, Silas Henderson, he's the sole heir, and according to this, the title is clear. The loans are paid." Davies snatched the papers, his face turning a blotchy red as he scanned them. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Silas Henderson. The name echoed in the silence. The quiet cowboy, the mender of fences, the man who ate his beans by the door, was the owner. He had been here all along, watching Working alongside them, a king in peasant's clothing. Davy sputtered, speechless. The cowboys stared, their mouths agape, and Alara felt the floor drop out from under her. Silas took a step back, his attention leaving the defeated banker. He turned, and his eyes found hers across the yard. In the stunned hush, with every eye upon them, he walked towards the cookhouse. He walked until he was standing right in front of her, so close she could see the dust on his lashes and the deep, quiet history in his eyes. He looked at her, then at the vast, broken, beautiful land stretching out behind her, and in a voice that was both a statement and a promise, he said, "This all belongs to you now." The world went silent. The wind, the distant lowing of cattle, the shocked gasps of the men, it all faded into a dull, roaring hum in Alara's ears. Silas's words hung in the air between them. Impossible, incomprehensible. What? The word was a breath, a faint puff of disbelief. Her mind scrambled to make sense of it, to find the trick, the misunderstanding. This was a cruel joke, a hallucination brought on by smoke inhalation and a heart full of ghosts. I don't understand," she stammered, shaking her head, taking a half step back. "This all belongs to you now," he repeated, his voice patient, his gaze unwavering. He held out his hand, not to touch her, but as an offering. In his palm lay a simple, worn iron key, the key to the main house, the one that had sat empty and boarded up since she'd arrived. The house of Mr. Henderson. His house. "No," she said, the word sharper this time. "No, you're wrong. This is yours. It's your name on the papers." She felt a wave of panic, a desperate need to refuse this absurdity. "I can't." She looked past him to the faces of the other men, who were now staring at her with a new, profound level of astonishment. She felt exposed, pinned by their gazes, by his. "Why?" he asked. The question was so simple, yet it cracked open everything she had kept locked away. Why me? Why? The reasons flooded her, a torrent of self-recrimination. Because I am a fraud. Because I am a woman who ran from a good life. Because I betrayed a man's love. Because I am unworthy of a shack, let alone a ranch. Because I am a ghost, and ghosts don't own things. They haunt them. My past," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. I know you get up before the sun," he said, his voice still quiet, still calm. "I know you scrub floors that will just get dirty again. I know you put a little extra honey in Billy's coffee because you know he has a sweet tooth. I know you mend the men's shirts when they're too proud to ask." He took a step closer and his eyes softened. "I know you ran into a burning barn for animals that weren't yours, on a ranch you thought you were about to lose. I didn't need to know your past. I watched your present." His words were not a grand declaration of love or a poetic speech. They were facts, simple, observed truths. He had not seen the stained, ruined woman she believed herself to be. He had seen the small daily acts of care, of resilience, of quiet dignity. He had seen the person she was, not the person she had been. The key was still in his outstretched hand. "My father left this place in a mess," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the land. "He loved it, but he wasn't a good businessman. I came back to either save it or bury it. I stayed quiet because I wanted to see the heart of it, to see if it was worth saving. And I saw you. You are the heart of it, Alara." A tear, hot and heavy, finally broke free and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear of grief, of release, of terrifying, brilliant hope. She looked from his earnest, open face to the iron key, to the vast, waiting land. It wasn't a reward. It wasn't a payment. It was a chance to stop running, a chance to build something new on the ruins of the old. Slowly, her trembling hand reached out and closed around the cool, heavy metal of the key. It felt like an anchor in a storm-tossed sea.